part of the motivation behind the podcast was to explore the language of sign spinning. And in those terms, after exploring the work of Sol LeWitt a little deeper than just the surface that I was exposed to initially, in developing the instructions and the definitions for these tricks, I couldn't help but like draw a parallel between, well, I guess to phrase it easier, like in some ways I almost see Justin as the Sol LeWitt of sign spinning for providing the instructions and the definitions for executing some of these tricks, in much the same way Sol provided instructions for the wall drawings.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that it rhymes, because if I'm not mistaken, the wall drawings had an expiration date, and so they weren't permanent. And it's kind of cool that sign spinning isn't permanent. In the way that you drive by, it's there and then it's gone. So with those terms, it's just crazy to think that this guy's been my Sol LeWitt in this industry.
I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to say, and I'd be curious if you was actually, talked to Carol, his wife, or the estate. I'm sure she has, but to go out on a limb and say he would have loved this, he would have loved you guys, not because, on the one hand, what was in his purview, right, was art with a capital A, no doubt about it, right? But the idea of culture at large in the broadest sense, right? So even though, the sentences on conceptual art are very much concerned with a wholly self-reflexive art, right? So they're basically, these are statements for artists, to artists, by artists, about artists. They're at the same time, there's a deep humanism in his work. And so an appreciation for culture in whatever shape and form that it could take, right? Is art simply the province of artists? I don't think he believed that, right? So everybody has the capacity to express themselves and to make things. And the more people who do it, right? Because at the end of the day, even though he was concerned with art with a capital A, he also believed radically democratic, right?
Yes, dude.
De-skilling and where art is might depend on, who is doing it and when, right? And so, but the idea of subjecting his ideas, right, as somehow generative of other ideas or other thoughts by taking his ideas and smashing them into something else and producing new ideas is a point where I just can't imagine that he wouldn't be just absolutely thrilled and delighted by what it is that you are capable of doing.
Yeah, a work of art may be understood as a conductor from the artist's mind to the viewers, right? Like.
Oh yeah. Oh, by any and he, so the idea of even these statements to challenge him, if it would have been a challenge, to say, well, why are these relegated to the page in the book? What if we actually just took them out into the world, right? Do they still hold? Or is life, are your ideas, and is art so precious that it can't survive out in the wild?
Yeah, how fragile is fragile is your creation?
Right.
Can it go through? It's like the preservation of truth. It's like no matter what you do to the truth, it remains the truth.
Yeah.
So there you go. Like in all context, a truth remains truth.
Yeah. So, but I think he would have been tickled, terribly tickled by seeing his stuff thrown up in the air, flipped around, spun around on corners in Los Angeles.
I think
they're no more or less true in that form than they are on the page.
Yeah, and I think I think all too often art is, people, as an artist, people say, I'm not, like, they'll say to me, like, I'm not an artist. I'm like, where does that come from? It's like people like actively not picking up the gift on the table. And it's like, and so I really appreciate this because it engages people in a way that automatically assumes that they are artists too. Mm-hmm. And it says like, hey, you're an artist, check this out. And they're like, wait, no, not me, who? And it's like, no, you. This message is for you. And they're like, okay, I'll think about it.
I love what you're saying about not taking the gift that's on the table. Right? Like, it's like, oh no, you can be an artist. Like, it's like,
should be.
And you should be. Right. You have the capacity.
Maybe the greatest thing you can do.
Yeah.
Is make something that like conveys your truth to someone else. And when you find that person and they say, yes, that is the truth, that is your kin. Like, that's right there. And it transcends everything. It transcends life, life and death, because, as we identify with these messages, we are transcending what it means to communicate. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't have to be alive to communicate.
Yeah. Something communicating from beyond the grave.
Yeah. It's like being spoken to by a ghost.
But the idea that the last sentence being that these sentences are not works of art is really great to say artwork removed for performance, right? When he explicitly said that the sentences are not works of art, but right, it's like, well, he said the sentences are not works of art, but the signs physically, it's like, are they the works of art, right? Once they've taken this form, right? And in your hands, to say, if he is saying that the sentences are not works of art, right? When they're in your hands, they become works of art.
In much the same way
we
when you plug in numbers to an
they
equation.
do. Like, it's like, so it isn't that they're just like reduced to material, which is really great to think about the piece, that the piece is actually transforming, right? So before I was saying, well, it's reduced to both material and then being subject to advertising. But in essence, what's really going on when that very last sentence says, these sentences aren't works of art, actually the statements on conceptual art under these conditions is being turned into a work of art. Taking them off the page in one, turning them into signs, right? Like with the boards, and then putting them in your hands. So it isn't that they become artwork by virtue of taking a material form. That could, one could argue and say, oh, that constitutes transforming them into art. But I would up the stakes and say, no, that might be, but what transformed them into really good art or really interesting art is when it is then subject to a performative act and gesture, right?
Yeah, and one of the things that I've always found fascinating about sign spinners are the facial expressions, because there's a lot of middle ground. There's a lot like kind of neutral, especially like newer sign spinners when they're like really mentally focused and they're like thinking about it. But there is either like this fully committed athletic fierceness, right, where it's just like, yeah, and then which I prefer the second, which is just like this aloof joyfulness.
Oh yeah.
Where it's just kind of like I'm having a good time and I don't really care how this goes. And you're like,
oh yeah.
How can you say you don't care when you just did that?
Right.
You have to care a little, right? It's like, no, I don't.
I mean, it's like for me, that would be, it's like, to put it, the skateboarding thing, it's like watching Mark Gonzalez skate, right? Watching him skate, it's like, he skates the way I drink a glass of water.
Yeah.
He skates, it's so fluid, it's just like, this is natural. He makes it look like, it's like, it's not this like, thing at all. Just his body, it's just like, oh wow, just him just skating down the street is such a graceful and elegant act, as opposed to like, oh wow, this is another kind of aggressive, extreme sports guy. And it's just like, no, these are just two totally different approaches.
Yeah.
You know, to the activity. But,
Yeah, I mean, Rodney Mullen, of course, is like, for me, and therefore sign spinning, Rodney Mullen just, it boggles the mind, you know, because skateboarding, evolving from surfing, you know, that makes sense to me. You know, you got hills, it's California, they're already good at the waves, so it would make sense that you could control the thing under the feet. But then Rodney Mullen, who, if I'm not mistaken, and I very well could be, like grew up away from, no, that's not right. But
I think you're right. He was flat in Florida.
Yeah, Florida, right? Yeah, and so just like, I don't have
skating.
I don't have hills.
Yeah.
I don't have hills. So what do I do? Yeah. And he's like, well, I could. And you're like,
right.
Oh God. Oh God. And it becomes this like, it's
great.
When you have more power than you know what to do with, you play with it.
Yeah.
And there is this realization that we are all much more powerful than anyone wants to give us credit for. And when you ignore that, you're able to explore your own creativity and your own power. And we do it through sign spinning and art.
Right.
But it is this, it's this feeling that like, you know, because we're operating under the rules of physics. That's really it. It's local sign code and physics. Yeah. Those are our problems.
But I like the gesture that you were doing to illustrate what Rodney Mullen was doing, because it wasn't it had a slapstick element to it, right? So when you were saying, it's like, well, there's the aggressive sports kind of a thing that could go on, or, you know, you could just be like, oh, I'm just having a good time. But what I like about that, there can also be an absurdist dimension where you are a prisoner of physics. It's like, you know, this is not working out, but that's okay.
I'll tell you, like, out of 273 tricks, and I can't claim credit for this, but seriously, one of my all-time favorites is the rowboat. because it just lets people know that I'm not that serious.
Right.
It's like, and then you pick it up and you say like, oh, well, I'm gonna do that. Oh God, long hair, where'd that come from?
Yeah.
It's been a while. How do you spin with long hair? How does that work?
Yeah, I also find less hair is better. Oh,
there it is.
Man.
And so then they're like, well, I don't know which to believe. Are you serious or not? It's like, oh, definitely not.
Yeah.
What are tricks? I forget them all. Can I steal some of yours?